The morning sun painted the New Mexico mesa in shades of rust and gold, but Samuel Garrett saw only the blood on his hands. Not real blood. That had been washed away 3 days ago when he'd found her collapsed by Willow Creek. The arrowhead lodged deep in her shoulder, fever burning through her like wildfire. But the memory of it stained everything now, even the coffee growing cold in his tin cup. He stood on the porch of his adobe ranch house, watching the horizon shimmer in the early heat. The silence stretched endlessly across the high desert, broken only by the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling the cottonwoods. This land had taught him to read its moods like scripture, the way shadows move across the mesas, how the wind carried scents of sage and rain still hours away. Today it felt different, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. Inside, Aiyana slept on the narrow bed he'd given up to her. Her breathing came easier now, no longer the shallow gasps that kept him awake those first 2 nights. Her people called her Eternal Blossom, though he learned this only yesterday when she'd whispered through cracked lips, her dark eyes finding his with clarity that cut through his carefully built solitude. The Apache words had rolled off her tongue like water over stone, musical and foreign, carrying meanings he could only guess at. The marriage certificate lay folded in his shirt pocket, still stiff with the territorial judge's official seal. A piece of paper that changed everything and nothing. Judge Morrison had asked no questions when Samuel rode into Mesilla, with Aiyana wrapped in blankets across his saddle, her fever breaking just enough for her to understand what he proposed. The old man had seen enough frontier justice to know when not to pry. By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd married desperate people before. Samuel rubbed his weathered palm against the porch rail, feeling the splinters catch his calluses. 23 years he'd worked this land, carved a life from red dirt and stubborn hope. The Garrett name meant something here. His father had signed treaties. His grandfather had traded fairly with the mescalero bands that moved through these mountains like seasons. But names meant nothing when blood ran hot, and revenge sang louder than reason. The feud had started over water rights, as most troubles did in this dry country. The Martinez family claimed the Garrett wells drew from springs sacred to their people, springs that had run strong for generations before white men came with their surveys and deeds. When Samuel's cattle had wandered onto disputed grazing land, shots were fired. Miguel Martinez, barely 19, lay buried now beneath a simple wooden cross, and his family's grief had transformed into something harder than the mountains themselves. Samuel had found Aiyana 3 miles from the Martinez homestead, the arrow bearing their mark. Whether she'd been running to him or from them, he didn't know, might never know. But when she looked up at him with eyes black as winter nights, something in his chest had cracked open like drought-hardened earth finally receiving rain. The sound came at dawn, not the usual chorus of mourning doves and coyotes, but something else entirely. Samuel's eyes snapped open in the chair where he'd spent another sleepless night, watching over Aiyana's recovery. Through the window, shapes move against the pale sky like shadows given substance. Horses, dozens of them. He moved quietly to the window, his bare feet soundless on the adobe floor. The mescalero Apache sat their mounts with the stillness of men who had learned patience from stones and sky. War paint streaked their faces in patterns that told stories he couldn't read, but their meaning was clear enough. They formed a loose circle around his property, close enough that he could see the morning light catch the metal of their weapons, far enough that their intentions remained as unclear as smoke. Behind him, Aiyana stirred. "They have come," she said, her voice still rough from fever, but carrying a strength that hadn't been there yesterday. Samuel turned to find her sitting up in bed, her long black hair falling loose around her shoulders. The wedding ring he'd placed on her finger, his mother's ring, the only thing of value he owned, caught the light like a promise made in silver. "Your people?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing shoulder. "My brother leads them. Nailnish, he who listens to the wind. He believes I was taken against my will." Her fingers traced the ring's simple band. He does not yet understand what this means. Samuel looked back toward the window. The warriors hadn't moved, but their presence filled the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. And the Martinez family? Also coming. Aiyana's voice carried a sadness deep as canyon shadows. Miguel was to be my husband. His death, it broke something that cannot be easily mended. The pieces fell together in Samuel's mind like puzzle fragments finding their places. Miguel Martinez and Aiyana had been promised each other, a union meant to bridge the gap between the Mexican homesteaders and the Apache bands that moved through these mountains. His death had shattered more than one family's dreams. It tore apart a fragile piece that had taken years to build. Samuel moved his gun belt hanging by the door, then stopped. Steel wouldn't solve this. If it could, the problem would have been settled 3 days ago in a hail of bullets rather than with wedding vows spoken over a feverish woman's bedside. "What do they want?" he asked. Aiyana rose slowly, favoring her injured shoulder. She wore one of his old shirts, the fabric hanging loose on her smaller frame. But she carried herself with a dignity that no borrowed clothes could diminish. Justice, or what they believe justice looks like. She paused at the window, her gaze finding her brother among the mounted warriors. "Nailnish thinks you killed Miguel to steal me. The Martinez family thinks you conspired with my people to murder their son. The truth is more complicated than either story." Samuel joined her at the window. The morning was warming, and heat already shimmered off the desert floor. In a few hours, the sun would be merciless, and men's tempers would fray like rope left too long in the weather. "What is the truth?" he asked quietly. Aiyana's reflection in the glass looked fragile as spun silver, but her voice was steady. "Miguel discovered that some of my tribe were planning to raid homesteader cattle. He came to warn me, to ask me to speak against it. He was a good man. He understood that peace served everyone." She touched the glass with her fingertips. "But others saw only a Mexican boy on Apache land after dark. The arrow that wounded me was meant for him. I tried to stop it." The weight of her words settled between them like dust after a windstorm. Samuel understood now why she'd been running that night, why she collapsed so far from her people's camp. She'd been carrying the burden of two families' grief, trying to bridge a gap that seemed to widen with each passing hour. Outside, one of the warriors raised his hand, and the morning stillness broke like glass. From the south, another group of riders approached. The Martinez family and their allies, their anger visible even at a distance in the hard line of their shoulders, the determined pace of their horses. The two groups faced each other across Samuel's yard like armies drawn up for battle, with his ranch house caught between them like a stone in a stream. The Martinez family had come in force. 3 generations of men whose faces bore the weathered lines of those who carved lives from unforgiving land. Their leader, Don Carlos Martinez, sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man holding grief and rage in equal measure. Samuel stepped onto his porch, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. The morning heat pressed against his back, but the silence that greeted him felt colder than winter wind. Aiyana appeared beside him, her presence both comfort and catalyst. The simple act of her standing at his side changed everything. What had been a man alone on his property became a married couple defending their home. Nailnish urged his horse forward, his movements fluid as water over stone. He was younger than Samuel had expected, perhaps 25, with eyes that held the deep intelligence of someone who'd learned to read the intentions of both men and weather. When he spoke, his English carried the careful precision of someone who'd chosen each word deliberately. "Samuel Garrett," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "You have taken what was not yours to take." Don Carlos spurred his horse closer, and Samuel could see Miguel's features echoed in the older man's face. The same high cheekbones, the same proud bearing that death had stolen too soon. "You think marriage makes you innocent, gringo? My son lies cold because of the violence you brought to our valley." Samuel felt Aiyana tense beside him, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Tio Carlos," she said, using the respectful address for an elder. "Your grief speaks, not your wisdom. Samuel Garrett saved my life. After his people put the arrow in you," Don Carlos replied, his Spanish accent thickening with emotion. "After they murdered my Miguel for the crime of loving you." Nailnish's horse pranced sideways, responding to its rider's tension. "My sister speaks like a woman whose mind has been poisoned by white man's medicine. She was taken from the place where she should have been safe, married without the consent of her family, to a man whose cattle drink water meant for our children." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. each one carrying years of accumulated grievance. Samuel understood that this moment had been building long before Aiyana collapsed by his creek, long before Miguel Martinez rode onto Apache land with warnings and good intentions. This was about water rights and grazing boundaries, about promises broken and pride wounded, about the impossible task of sharing a land that seemed to shrink a little more each year. "I didn't take her," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the mounting tension. "I found her bleeding by Willow Creek, 3 miles from your land, Don Carlos." The arrow bore Apache markings, but it wasn't meant for her. He paused, letting his words settle. "It was meant for your son." A murmur rippled through both groups. Nailnish's expression hardened, but Samuel saw something else flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps even recognition. Don Carlos leaned forward in his saddle, his weathered hands gripping the reins until his knuckles showed white. "You lie," Don Carlos said, but his voice lacked conviction. Aiyana stepped forward, her chin raised despite the pain that moving caused her shoulder. "I speak truth, uncle. Miguel came to warn me that some of our young warriors planned to raid homesteader cattle. He was trying to prevent bloodshed." Her voice carried across the yard like wind through canyon walls. "When he approached our camp, Kestrel and his followers saw only an enemy. I threw myself between them, but I was too late to save Miguel's life. Too late to save my own from the arrow meant for him." Nailnish dismounted in one fluid motion, his moccasins silent on the hard-packed earth. "Kestrel acted without the council's blessing," he said quietly, the admission coming like blood from a wound. "But that does not make this marriage valid. You are Apache. You belong with your people." "She belongs with her husband," Samuel said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. 3 days ago, he'd been a man who spoke mainly to his horses and the wind. Now he stood claiming a woman he barely knew, bound to her by desperate circumstance and a piece of paper that might not be worth the ink that signed it. But when Aiyana's fingers found his, their touch light as butterfly wings, he knew that some bonds couldn't be measured in legal documents or tribal customs. Some promises were written in deeper things. In the trust of a wounded woman who let a stranger tend her fever, in the choice to stand between bullets and innocence, in the recognition that sometimes salvation came wearing an unexpected face. The sun climbed higher, and with the tension that stretched between the two groups like a wire pulled near to breaking. Samuel could smell the sweat of nervous horses, the metallic tang of weapons kept ready, the underlying scent of sagebrush heating in the morning air. His cattle had moved to the far pasture, their animal instincts warning them away from the human drama unfolding in their territory. Don Carlos dismounted slowly, his movements heavy with grief and years. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd buried too many dreams in the hard earth of New Mexico. "Show me where you found her," he said to Samuel. "Show me the place where my son's blood was spilled." Samuel nodded toward the creek that wound through his property like a silver thread. "Willow Creek, by the old cottonwood." "But Don Carlos," he hesitated, then pushed forward. "Your son's body isn't there. I searched for him after I found Aiyana. Someone moved him." A new tension crackled through the assembled riders. Nailnish remounted his horse in one smooth motion, his face unreadable as carved stone. "Kestrel," he said, the name carrying the weight of understanding and regret. He would have taken the body to hide his shame, or to hide evidence of murder. Don Carlos replied, but his anger was cooling into something harder to fight, doubt. Aiyana spoke in rapid Apache to her brother, her words flowing like water over stones. Samuel caught fragments, Kestrel, shame, and what sounded like a name for Miguel. Nailnish's responses were shorter, clipped, the speech of a man weighing difficult choices. Finally, Nailnish turned to Don Carlos. "My sister speaks of a place where Kestrel takes his secrets, a box canyon in the Oregon mountains where he believes the spirits cannot see his deeds." He paused, studying the older man's face. "If Miguel Martinez lies there, we will find him, and we will know the truth of how he died." Don Carlos looked between Nailnish and Samuel, his weathered features working through calculations that went beyond mere geography. To ride with Apache warriors into their sacred places meant trust of a kind that hadn't existed between their peoples for generations. But to let his son remain hidden meant accepting a version of events that might be built on lies. "I will go," he said finally, "but not alone. My nephew Joaquin comes with me." And he looked at Samuel with eyes that held no friendship, but perhaps the beginning of respect. "The gringo comes too. If he speaks truth, let him prove it where truth cannot hide." Samuel felt a familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. To leave Aiyana now, surrounded by warriors who might see his absence as abandonment, carried its own risks. But to refuse Don Carlos's implicit challenge would confirm every suspicion about his motives. "I'll go," he said, "but my wife stays here, under protection of her brother's man." The word wife hung in the air like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of meaning through both groups. Nailnish's jaw tightened, but he didn't contradict the claim. Instead, he gave a sharp nod to two of his warriors, men whose faces bore the patient strength of those who'd learned to guard what mattered most. "Ciala and Naten will remain," he said. "No harm will come to my sister, while we seek the truth." Don Carlos mounted his horse with the care of a man whose bones remembered too many hard rides. "Then we ride now, before the sun makes the mountains into furnaces." He looked at Aiyana with an expression that mixed sorrow and something that might have been hope. "Mija, if your husband speaks truth, then much will need to be forgiven on both sides." Aiyana stepped down from the porch, moving carefully but with determination. She approached Don Carlos's horse and placed her hand on his boot, a gesture that spoke of old affection and shared grief. Miguel was a good man. Uncle, he deserved better than the death kestrel gave him. But his spirit will not rest until the truth is spoken and justice is done. Not the kind that comes from rifles and revenge, but the kind that builds bridges where walls once stood. Don Carlos looked down at her, and for a moment his weathered mask slipped to reveal the man who'd watched her grow from child to woman, who'd blessed her betrothal to his son with dreams of unity between their peoples. "You have grown wise, Mija, perhaps wiser than the men who claim to lead." He straightened in his saddle and looked toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants against the blue sky. "We ride to find my son, and when we return, we will speak of what comes next." The Oregon Mountains rose from the desert floor like the spine of some massive buried creature, their jagged peaks catching the morning light in shades of purple and gold. Samuel rode between Nailnish and Don Carlos, their three horses picking their way along trails that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. Behind them, Joaquin Martinez followed with two Apache warriors whose names Samuel hadn't caught, but whose vigilance was unmistakable. The silence between the men carried the weight of unspoken questions. Samuel found himself studying Nailnish in the corner of his eye, trying to read the emotions that played across the younger man's face like shadows on canyon walls. There was grief there and anger, but also something else, a burden of leadership that Samuel recognized from his own struggles to keep his ranch running against the odds. "Your sister," Samuel said eventually, his voice low enough not to carry to the others. "She chose to trust me." "Why?" Nailnish was quiet for so long that Samuel thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came carefully, like a man stepping across unstable ground. "Aiyana sees things others cannot. When she was a child, she would find lost cattle before the vaqueros knew they were missing. She would know when storms were coming days before the clouds gathered." He paused, his dark eyes scanning the trail ahead. "She told me once that you carried the same sadness she did, the weight of trying to hold worlds together when they want to fall apart." The observation struck Samuel like a physical blow. He'd spent so many years alone on his ranch, convincing himself that solitude was strength, that needing nothing from others made him somehow more complete. But Aiyana had seen through that carefully constructed independence to something truer underneath. Don Carlos raised his hand, calling a halt. They'd reached a narrow defile between two towering rock formations, a place where the trail split into three directions, each leading deeper into the mountain's heart. The old man dismounted and studied the ground with the attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the stories written in dust and stone. "Here," he said, kneeling beside what looked to Samuel like unmarked earth. "Someone passed this way recently. Heavy burden, moving carefully." He looked up at Nailnish. "Your kestrel, perhaps?" Nailnish dismounted and examined the ground himself, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt that spoke a language Samuel was only beginning to understand. 2 horses, he said after a moment. One carrying a rider, one carrying... He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. The trail led them higher, winding through stands of pinyon pine and juniper that provided blessed shade from the climbing sun. Samuel's horse, a steady bay mare named Sage, picked her way confidently along the rocky path, her mountain-bred instincts compensating for his relative inexperience with this harsh terrain. They rode in single file now, the trail too narrow for conversation. Samuel found his thoughts drifting back to Aiyana, wondering what she was doing at this moment, whether she felt as strange about their sudden marriage as he did. The ring on her finger had belonged to his mother, a woman who died when Samuel was barely 12, leaving him to learn the harder lessons of life from his taciturn father and the unforgiving land itself. His mother had been gentle where his father was stern, able to find beauty in the harsh landscape that surrounded their ranch. She taught Samuel to notice the way morning light caught the mountains, how the desert bloomed after rain, why the coyotes sang differently in autumn than in spring. Looking back, he realized that those lessons had kept him sane during the long years of solitude that followed his father's death. There, Nailnish said, pointing toward a gap in the canyon wall that was barely visible until they were almost upon it. The hidden place. The canyon beyond was smaller than Samuel had expected, a circular amphitheater of red rock that rose perhaps 100 feet on all sides. A thin stream trickled down one wall, supporting a small grove of cottonwoods whose leaves whispered secrets in the mountain wind. It was beautiful in the way that hidden places often are, but there was something else here, a heaviness that pressed against the chest like the weight of unspoken sins. They found Miguel Martinez beneath the largest cottonwood, his body wrapped in a blanket that couldn't quite hide the violence of his death. Don Carlos dismounted heavily and knelt beside his son, his weathered hands shaking as he pulled back the covering. The arrow wound was clearly visible, high in the chest where it would have found the heart quickly. "Apache arrow," Don Carlos said, his voice hollow with grief confirmed, "but not shot from ambush. See how the angle..." He traced the air above the wound. Miguel was facing his killer, close enough to see his eyes. Nailnish studied the body with the detached attention of a warrior who'd seen death before. "Kestrel's arrow," he confirmed. "I would know his fletching anywhere." He looked around the hidden canyon, his expression darkening. But why bring him here? Why not leave him where he fell? Samuel walked the perimeter of the clearing, his instincts telling him there was more to discover. The ground showed signs of disturbance beyond what would be expected from a simple burial. Scuff marks, disturbed vegetation, the kind of signs left by struggle. "Here," he called, pointing to a patch of earth near the stream. Someone was here before Miguel, recently but not today. They gathered around the spot Samuel had found. The evidence was subtle but clear to eyes that knew how to read it. A makeshift camp, hastily abandoned. The ashes of a small fire, carefully scattered but not completely cold. And pressed into the soft earth beside the stream, the clear print of a woman's moccasin. Nailnish knelt and studied the footprint, his face grave. When he looked up, his eyes held a new understanding. "Aiyana," he said quietly. "She was here before she was wounded, before she came to your ranch." He paused, working through the implications. She came here to stop Kestrel, to convince him not to raid the Martinez cattle. The pieces fell together with terrible clarity. Aiyana had discovered Kestrel's plan and had come to this hidden place to confront him. Miguel had followed, either tracking her or pursuing the same goal of preventing bloodshed. The confrontation had ended in violence, with Miguel dead and Aiyana wounded by an arrow meant to ensure her silence. Don Carlos rose slowly, his grief transforming into something harder. "Your sister," he said to Nailnish, "tried to save my son. She came here to prevent war, and your warrior repaid her courage with treachery." Nailnish's hands clenched into fists. "Kestrel will answer for this, to the council, to the spirits, and to the families he has wronged." He looked at Samuel with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You saved more than my sister's life, Samuel Garrett. You saved her honor." The ride back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence, each man lost in thoughts that weighed heavier than the mountain air. Samuel found himself seeing the landscape differently now, not as a backdrop to his solitary existence, but as a stage for a larger drama in which he'd unknowingly become a central player. The sagebrush and scrub oak, the distant mesas that shimmered in the afternoon heat, the very air itself seemed charged with the responsibility of truth revealed. Don Carlos rode with Miguel's body secured across a pack horse, his shoulders bearing the dual burden of grief and understanding. The old man's weathered face showed the strain of reconciling the son he'd lost with the larger tragedy that had claimed him. Every mile brought them closer to decisions that would reshape the relationships between three families who'd been locked in mutual mistrust for generations. As they descended from the mountains, the ranch came into view like a small island of human habitation in the vast sea of high desert. Samuel could see figures moving around the buildings. Aiyana, identifiable even at a distance by the careful way she moved, still favoring her wounded shoulder, and the Apache warriors who'd remained to guard her. The sight of his home, temporarily occupied by people who'd been strangers a week ago, should have felt like an invasion. Instead, it looked like what had never been before, a place where more than one person belonged. What happens now? Samuel asked as they approached a yard where 24 armed men still waited in careful formation. Nailnish considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Kestrel must be found and brought before the council. Justice must be seen, not just spoken. He paused, watching his sister emerge from the ranch house. But justice for one man's crimes does not solve the larger problem. The water rights, the grazing disputes, the fear that makes neighbors into enemies. These will remain unless we choose a different path. Don Carlos spoke without taking his eyes off his son's body. Miguel believed that path was possible. He died trying to build bridges between our peoples. His voice carried the weight of decision being made. Perhaps his death can still serve that purpose, if we have the courage to honor his sacrifice properly. They rode into the yard, and the careful formations of mounted men shifted like pieces on a chessboard. Samuel dismounted and immediately went to Aiyana, who met him with eyes that held questions she was too wise to ask in front of the assembled witnesses. Instead, she simply took his hand, and the gesture spoke louder than words about the choice she'd made and the price she was willing to pay for it. "We found him," Samuel said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "And we found the truth." Aiyana nodded, her fingers tightening on his. Kestrel? Gone, but not beyond reach. Don Carlos had dismounted and was carefully lifting his son's body from the pack horse. The sight of Miguel's wrapped form sent a ripple of movement through both groups of armed men, hands moving instinctively toward weapons before discipline and respect for the dead reasserted control. "My son," Don Carlos announced, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "died trying to prevent a war. He came to warn our Apache neighbors of planned raids, and he died for his courage." He looked directly at the Apache warriors. "He was killed by one of your own, but he was trying to save lives on both sides. Let that be remembered when we speak of justice." Nailnish stepped forward, his own voice formal and clear. "Miguel Martinez will be honored among my people as a peacebringer. His death was a crime against the natural order, committed by one who forgot that Apache honor protects the innocent." He paused, his gaze finding each of the Martinez men in turn. "Kestrel will be found and brought to answer for his actions. This I swear by the spirits of my ancestors." The words hung in the air like smoke from a ceremonial fire, binding the speakers to courses of action that would echo through the years to come. Samuel felt the weight of history settling around them, the sense that this moment would be remembered and retold, becoming part of the larger story of how enemies chose to become something else. But even as the formal promises were made, Samuel knew that the real work lay ahead. Finding Kestrel would be only the beginning. The deeper challenge would be turning the tragedy of Miguel's death into the foundation for something better, a peace that could outlast the passions of the moment and the inevitable tensions that would rise as people tried to share a land that never felt quite large enough for all who needed it. Aiyana stepped closer to him, her presence a reminder that some bridges were already built, some choices already made. The ring on her finger caught the afternoon sun, and Samuel realized that whatever else happened, his life had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. The solitude he thought he needed had given way to something more complex and infinitely more valuable. the recognition that some burdens were meant to be shared, some battles fought side by side rather than alone. 3 days later, smoke rose from a dozen fires scattered across the meadow behind Samuel's ranch house. The Apache band had made temporary camp there, their wickiups arranged in the traditional pattern that honored the four directions and the flow of protective spirits. The sight of their settlement on his land should have made Samuel nervous, but instead, he found it oddly comforting. Proof that the earth could support more than one way of living if people chose cooperation over conflict. Aiyana moved between the Apache camp and the ranch house with increasing confidence, her wounded shoulder healing well enough that she could perform light tasks. Samuel watched her teach his housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, a Chinese woman who'd come to New Mexico with the railroad crews and stayed when her husband died in a construction accident, how to prepare a cornmeal in the traditional way. The sight of the two women working side by side, sharing techniques and laughing at their mutual attempts to communicate across language barriers, felt like a glimpse of the kind of future Miguel Martinez had died trying to create. The formal council was set for sunset, when the heat would begin to break, and the spirits would be most receptive to human appeals for wisdom. Representatives from the Apache band, the Martinez family, and the territorial government would gather to address not just Kestrel's crimes, but the underlying disputes that had made violence seem inevitable. Samuel found himself appointed as an unwilling mediator, his marriage to Aiyana having made him a bridge between communities whether he'd asked for the role or not. Judge Morrison had ridden out from Mesilla to lend official weight to proceedings, his presence a reminder that the territorial government had its own interests in seeing peace established in this corner of New Mexico. "You nervous?" Aiyana asked, finding him on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Samuel considered the question honestly. "Terrified," he admitted. 3 days ago I was a man who talked mainly to his horses. Now I'm supposed to help settle disputes that go back generations." Aiyana smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "My people have a saying, the wind doesn't ask the canyon for permission to blow through it, but both are changed by the encounter." She touched his arm gently. "You didn't ask to be part of this, but you're here, and your presence changes everything." The council assembled as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Samuel had arranged chairs and blankets in a circle around a central fire, following Aiyana's guidance about the proper forms for such gatherings. The flames cast dancing shadows on the faces of participants, giving the proceedings an otherworldly quality that seemed appropriate for discussions that would shape the future of the region. Nailnish spoke first, his words carrying the formal cadence of traditional Apache oratory. He began with acknowledgments to the spirits of the place, to the ancestors who watched over such proceedings, and to the natural forces that govern all human affairs. Samuel found himself surprisingly moved by the ritual aspect of the opening, the way ancient protocols created space for modern problems to be addressed with proper gravity. Don Carlos responded with his own formal statement, delivered in the Spanish that had been the language of diplomacy in this region for centuries before English-speaking settlers arrived. His words carried the weight of grief transformed into determination, the promise that his son's death would serve a purpose beyond mere tragedy. Judge Morrison, representing the territorial government, spoke with the careful precision of a man who understood that his words would be scrutinized by federal authorities in Washington. The territory's interest in peaceful relations between all residents was real, he assured the council, backed by the full authority of American law, but tempered by respect for traditional ways of resolving disputes. Then it was Samuel's turn to speak, and he felt the weight of every eye upon him. He had no formal training in diplomacy, no experience in addressing mixed audiences with competing interests and ancient grievances. What he had was a practical knowledge of a man who'd spent his life making marginal land productive, who understood that survival in harsh country required both stubbornness and flexibility. "I'm not a politician or a chief," he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I'm a rancher who knows that water flows downhill regardless of who claims to own it, that cattle need grass whether they belong to Anglo or Mexican or Apache, that weather doesn't read property deeds before it brings drought or flood." He paused, looking around the circle at faces that were beginning to show interest rather than mere politeness. "Miguel Martinez died because one man chose violence over conversation," Samuel continued. "But he also died because the rest of us had let talking become so difficult that a good man felt he had to risk everything just to deliver a warning. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward toward the stars. We can honor his sacrifice by making sure that never happens again, by creating spaces where people can speak truthfully without fear, where problems get solved before they become blood feuds. Aiyana's hand found his in the firelight, and her touch gave him the courage to push toward the heart of what needed to be said. This land is big enough for all of us, but only if we stop treating it like something to be conquered and start treating it like something to be shared. The Apache know where the water runs clean and where the grass grows thickest. The Mexican settlers know how to build irrigation systems in which crops will flourish in different soils. The Anglo farmers and ranchers bring new techniques and access to Eastern markets. He looked directly at each of the community leaders. Separately, we all struggle. Together, we might actually thrive. The council fire crackled as Kestrel emerged from the darkness, his war paint streaked with tears. Behind him rode 4 Apache warriors, their faces grim with the weight of difficult choices. Samuel felt Aiyana's hand tighten on his, as the young warrior dismounted with fluid grace. "I come because running would make me a coward as well as a killer," Kestrel said, his voice carrying across the circle. "Miguel Martinez came to warn us of conspiracy to poison our water sources. I killed him in ignorance, thinking he was part of the threat he sought to expose." Don Carlos rose slowly, grief carved deep in his weathered features. Judge Morrison examined the blood-stained document Kestrel produced, evidence of territorial officials planning systematic poisoning of Apache lands. The scope of the conspiracy staggered everyone present. "Miguel died a hero," Aiyana said softly. "Kestrel bears a killer's burden. Both deserve justice, not the kind that comes from rifles, but the kind that honors sacrifice." Don Carlos studied the young Apache for a long moment before extending his hand. "I cannot forgive you yet," he said, "but I can work with you to expose the men who created the conditions that led to my son's death." Their handshake sealed an alliance born from tragedy, witnessed by stars and firelight. The real enemy wasn't each other. It was a corruption that had turned neighbors into weapons against one another. 3 weeks later, the territorial courthouse in Santa Fe buzzed with tension as federal investigators from Washington examined evidence of the conspiracy. Kestrel sat in the witness chair, his Apache clothing incongruous but his testimony devastating. He described meetings overheard, officials identified, plans that reached far beyond water poisoning to coordinated land seizure. Samuel served as cultural interpreter, his marriage to Aiyana making him a bridge between worlds. The investigators struggled to understand the complex relationships between communities, but the documentary evidence was undeniable. 3 territorial officials were arrested, including the man who'd signed the poisoning orders. Don Carlos testified about his son's final weeks, the growing suspicion that had led Miguel to investigate unusual meetings between government officials and Eastern investors. His voice never wavered as he described finding Miguel's hidden notes, the evidence that had cost his son his life but would now serve justice. The trial became a sensation throughout the territory. Newspapers from as far as Denver sent reporters to cover the unprecedented cooperation between Apache, Mexican, and Anglo communities. What had begun as a blood feud had transformed into something larger, a demonstration that justice could transcend cultural boundaries when people chose courage over convenience. 1 year later, Samuel stood on his porch watching Aiyana tend their garden, her movements graceful despite her growing belly. The child would be born in autumn, a bridge between worlds like its parents' marriage had become. The Apache wickiups were gone from his meadow, but the friendship remained, marked by regular visits and shared meals. Don Carlos had built a shrine to Miguel near Willow Creek, where fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by Apache children who'd learned to honor the young Mexican who died trying to save their people. Kestrel worked as a territorial scout now, his knowledge of the mountains serving law enforcement rather than raiding parties. The water rights dispute had been resolved through negotiation rather than violence, with Judge Morrison mediating an agreement that recognized both Apache traditional claims and settler development needs. The poison springs had been cleaned and new wells dug where all communities could access clean water. Samuel's cattle grazed peacefully alongside Apache horses and Martinez sheep, the boundaries marked by cooperation rather than conflict. Mrs. Chun had married an Apache widower, Their union is unexpected as Samuel and Aiyana's, but equally rooted in practical affection and shared resilience. As sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Samuel reflected on how quickly life could change. A year ago, he'd been a lonely man convinced that solitude was strength. Now he understood that some kinds of strength could only be found in connection, to the land, to community, to the belief that enemies could become family if people had courage enough to choose hope over fear. The first stars appeared as Aiyana joined him on the porch, her hand finding his with the certainty of long practice. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs the desert night, and Samuel finally understood why his mother had taught him to listen for beauty in harsh places. Sometimes the most profound peace came after the greatest struggle, and the strongest foundations were built on ground that had been tested by fire.